I'd like to start by thanking my friend Alex Buffalohead for joining me in this conversation today. It's an honor to have her join me in talking about the significance of place as it relates to the works that we'll talk about today. Alex is a curator, an artist, and a part of the Dakota community. This work is about making room for conversation, about multiple voices, and about learning to recognize when narratives are absent, and also about learning about the history of the land that we inhabit. So both Alex and I reside in Minnesota, which is the ancestral homeland of the Dakota Nation. As we begin, I'd like to recognize and acknowledge the Dakota people of the past, present, and future, and offer respect as we talk about Minnesota Makoche, Minnesota. Proceeds of this project have been donated to Illuminative, which is an organization and resource designed to increase the visibility of and challenge the negative narrative about Native nations and peoples in American society. So thank you so much, Alex. If you have any words you want to share as well.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm really honored to be here with you and to be speaking with you all virtually. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Alex Buffalohead. I'm Bedawakantuan, Dakota, a citizen of Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, which is a nation in North Dakota and South Dakota. However, I grew up here in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. I am a arts and cultural engagement manager at a Native-led nonprofit organization called Native American Community Development Institute. And one of our biggest projects is our gallery called All My Relations Arts, which is in Minneapolis and on the American Indian Cultural Corridor on East Franklin Avenue. Encourage you all to visit us when the pandemic is over. I'm currently speaking in Richfield, Minnesota, so I'm on my own homelands of unceded territory of the Dakota. Minnesota comes from the word Minnesota, which translate to English as lands that reflect the water in the sky. Minnesota is also homeland to the Anishinaabe people in Ho-Chunk, and we have a huge urban population of over 70 plus Native nations and other Indigenous people in Minnesota. And I'd just like to acknowledge that even though we're speaking virtually, but I'd like to recognize that in Rochester, it's the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, and to honor the sovereignty of the Six Nations, the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora. And I just want to share that this acknowledgement isn't to be performative, but to be kind of a first step of learning the history of where we're speaking. And I encourage everyone to look up where they currently are and just research more of the land acknowledgement movement and land back movement. I would like to share that Michelle and I are speaking from our perspectives and experiences of what we have learned, and would like to acknowledge our teachers and those who have done the research and learning before us, and that we are still on our learning journey, and that there's still more work and research that needs to be done.
Thank you, Alex, for reminding us that this is, of course, an educational journey for many of us, learning the narratives of the places that we reside. And for me, this project is a learning journey that began in November of 2012. I heard an episode of This American Life that would send me on a 4-year photographic journey and change my understanding of Minnesota history forever. The episode is called Little War on the Prairie, and I encourage you to look it up if you get the chance. The podcast recounts the US-Dakota War, which happened here in Minnesota and took place in 1862 between the early white settlers and the Dakota peoples who are native to Minnesota. It also laments the fact that many Minnesotans are not aware of this tragic part of our state's history. The war itself concluded in Mankato with the largest mass execution in United States history, which was 38 Dakota men. There was an internment camp at the base of Fort Snelling and the forced expulsion of Dakota people from their homeland. So realizing that my own education about the land that I inhabit had failed me and was lacking, I began researching and traveling around to as many of the state erected monuments and memorials and markers as close to the significant date as possible. So this is the work that MCC acquired for their permanent collection. It's called Camp Release State Monument, and it's in Montevideo, Minnesota. This work was made in 2016. And the significant date on this particular monument was September 26th, 1862. So this is the significant date is actually when um, it's said that the war actually ended. So this is when the Dakota people officially surrendered. And so it's marked as the end of that war. The interesting thing about that conflict is it began in mid-August of 1862 and concluded in September, on September 26th, also of 1862. So it was fairly short, but then the repercussions that affected the Dakota people, those effects are still lasting for generations following this point in time. The interesting thing about going to each of these places as close to the significant date as possible was that I became really aware of the fact that monuments are kind of a static snapshot of the time that they were made, the history as it was understood in that moment, and often only from one perspective. So many of these, there's now thankfully in the state of Minnesota an effort to create markers that tell a more equitable recollection of the history on placards next to these monuments. But the monuments themselves often only have this one perspective etched into the stone. So this monument also was interestingly erected 12 years after the event occurred, which is kind of interesting to think about the gap in time between the significant event and when this memorial was actually erected. So we're going to talk a little bit about just the language of memorial. The visual language of memory is one that's fairly familiar to us. Headstones, the obelisk, stone figures on a plinth, photographs, and something that became really underscored for me as I continued doing this project was that without the action of remembering, what do these objects actually mean, and to whom? So thinking about this idea of these monuments being what Susan Sontag calls objects of contemplation, we're kind of meant to walk around them. The scale is often much bigger than our bodies. They have this kind of imposing size that evokes a sense of presence. And so in some ways it's almost like you can't deny the story that's embedded there. And there's this perception that these monuments tell a truth of some kind. But I think it's as Alex and I have been in conversation about many of these things, it's kind of a tricky and troubling way to think about history as having only one perspective. So Alex, I wondered if you would share some of your perspective on what these objects of memory mean from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I mean, just looking at your slide, I think it's so fascinating that this iconic piece is used and reused in so many different ways. To the right of the image, there's the Fauché Tower, which at one point was the tallest skyscraper in downtown Minneapolis. And I remember like driving through downtown and my dad saying, oh, that used to be like the only one at some point. And that blew my mind, but I never really drew the connection that this symbol could be connected to one person, the United States first president, George Washington. From my perspective, I grew up with both my parents are Native. One is an educator, he's an anthropologist, and constantly kind of being told to question what I'm being taught at schools. And sometimes information in my textbooks weren't accurate. I was privileged to go to Washington, D.C. and seeing this piece, I don't know, with myself, it was kind of challenging and kind of problematic in that with knowing the history of what Washington has done to Indigenous people, to my Dakota relatives, is challenging for a sixth grader. And now I'm 30 years old, and it's, I feel like, easier to understand, but it's, I think, important to research these people and why, and question why their image and their name is used so widely, with state names to marketing of apples. So I think it's important to note that Washington, not only is he our first president, but was a slave owner, and he also ordered the destruction of indigenous communities in favor of the American cause, for westward expansion, and to kind of get rid of tribal homelands and force it into American territories, and then from American territories to states. But also, I think it's important to acknowledge that, yes, there's these English names for places, but there's also indigenous place names for where we are. Like Minnesota is a Dakota name. We have cities called Minnetonka, Chaskey, which is pronounced Chaskey. There's Winona, which is like the first female in Dakota. There's names from original villages like Black Dog, and I would encourage viewers to research names that don't seem like they're in English, and to learn the history of what it means, and recognize that these places had names, that, like, New York wasn't originally New York, and what does it mean to put the word new onto a name of a state? What does that mean? Is that a form of erasure? Because to me, I think it is.
So I think it's so interesting to think about this idea of street names being named after Washington, or the Washington Memorial having this kind of similarity to a lot of these obelisk forms. And so when I created this exhibition, which is an exhibition that I did in 2016, called The Shape of Memory. And that's where most of these cutout obelisk forms were in this exhibition. I started thinking about, like, what does it mean to take out the monument? So all of these photographs have the monument that has been photoshopped out, and then the front image, so it's two images, is a laser cut of the monument. So it's kind of like this two-layered thing, creating a shadow where the monument is still visible, but it's for the most part a shadow of that object. But I started thinking about, like, what does it mean to take the narrative out of the landscape, and not have any telling of the history available. So as I started thinking about, like, what this exhibition would look like, I started thinking that it would be important to have resources in the exhibition itself, so people could start actually down this road of learning more about the history of the places that they live. So I designed and commissioned this coffee table that's in the center here. It's actually meant to look like a compressed obelisk. So rather than having this kind of aggressive form that interrupts the horizon line, it's this form that's kind of compressed and has a space for all of these different resources. And all of the resources that I included were either by Indigenous authors, or authors who were paying special attention to an equitable telling of the history of these spaces. So as I was traveling to all of these different spaces, it became really, really clear to me that this idea of kind of like stamping the landscape with this stone object is something that's kind of this repeated form that we see uh, all across the country, but particularly the monuments that were put up to the U.S. Dakota War tend to be obelisks. So I visited 15 of the state erected obelisks in the state of Minnesota. So you can kind of see in this image, there's 15 of these monuments. All of these are in the order. So when this is installed, each of these images is installed in the from left to right, from top to bottom, in the dates, according to the dates that they were erected. And all of these monuments tend to be kind of the formal variation on the obelisk, and each recounts a different story. So like a different battle or a different moment in the history of this conflict. The visual similarity, it was kind of staggering, but the really interesting thing to me was that the first monument, which you can see in the upper left-hand corner, this one is maybe about 5 feet tall, maybe 6 feet tall. It's more like body size. And as time progressed, the monuments get larger and larger. And so the one in the bottom right-hand corner is actually 25 feet tall. So we go from kind of a human scale to this larger than life scale. And the other interesting thing about going to all of these different spaces is they're all in different kinds of spaces. So like some of them are located in graveyards. Some of them are in wooded areas that are extremely remote. Some of them are actually in people's backyards. There's one that is in the center on the top that's actually in the center of a busy street between a middle school and a courthouse. So another interesting thing to note here is that the first one was actually erected shortly after the US-Dakota War concluded, and the very last one you see here wasn't erected until 1925. So if you can just like for a moment there, think about like, what does it mean and how would the telling of the history change shortly after it happened versus 63 years later, which is kind of staggering when you think about it. But then I was also starting to think about this idea of the horizon line being interrupted. And you look at all of these images, and many of them are in natural spaces. And so what would it mean to return the land back to its original state rather than having this kind of aggressive marker that's interrupting the horizon line in a way that in some ways kind of um, seems to imply a truth that's hard to surmount, right? Like if you embed something that's 25 feet tall into the landscape, um, that's a hard thing to find another narrative to be in conversation with it, right? Because it is this tall thing. So all of these are mostly made out of granite, and all of them are kind of varying scales, but mosely from the very beginning here, we have this smaller monument, and then they go anywhere from the smaller 5 foot, 6 foot monument to 25 plus feet tall. Um, Alex, you had mentioned some interest in this kind of idea of the materials that they're made out of, that these monuments are made out of. And I wondered if you would speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I think your image of your wooden table obelisk is just a great, I don't know, it's just a powerful statement. And the more I hear you talk about it and look at it, I just keep thinking like, wow, I'm curious of like how intentional it was. But I think it's really important just to note the materials that you used with your obelisk, the table that it's made out of wood, which I think kind of, I don't know, alludes more to indigenous life ways of using more natural materials instead of extracting stone and whatnot and carving into sacred land and whatnot, like Washington Monument. And yeah, I think it's important for us to question who made these monuments and why did they choose these materials? Where did the materials come from? Who commissioned it?
These are all such important questions. So I wanted to talk a bit more, and I think that speaks so much to this idea of perspective, right? Of course, whoever is creating this obelisk is somebody who has a perspective. If it's created a certain time after the significant event, they're meaning to communicate something very specific. So all of these images that are, I call them the cutouts. the cutout series. So this is an image of the Defenders Monument, which is the one I mentioned that's in the middle of a busy street, and there's a middle school on one side and a courthouse on the other. And so the way that these are made is I photograph head on the monument, and then I oftentimes will take pictures on the other side of the monument to see what that landscape view would look like if the monument wasn't obstructing my view. So another idea about this way of controlling people's perspective, right? Like there's this thing that is now in my view, and so what does it mean to take it out? So I'm using, when I'm creating these, I'm either taking the photograph that I've taken like on the other side of the monument and then actually photoshopping that in, or on the right hand side, I was painstakingly using the clone stamp tool to basically rebuild this wall. And also there's another tool which seemed sort of an interesting parallel to this idea of what does it mean to restore a landscape, or what does it mean to return land. So this idea of using a healing brush tool became kind of interesting to me. Like, what does it mean to actually repetitively, with great care, try to restore these surfaces? But then another interesting thing about these works is I was trying to create this idea of altering the forms to kind of create a space for the narratives that are not present. And the thing about each of these images is, because they are two layers, the back layer and then the front layer that is floated just a little, about maybe a half an inch away from the back layer, they only line up from a very specific perspective. And that's very intentional, actually. This idea of your perspective only lines up if you are standing and looking at it head on, and from eye level, which is usually on the wall maybe about 58 inches to center. So if we look at them from the side, they actually don't line up. The lines stop meeting each other and perspectives change. So these cutout monuments only line up if you're looking at them from one very specific perspective, which if you think about the narratives that are embedded, that tends to be the case, right? So the intention with these was not necessarily like an act of aggression. I wasn't like aggressively like photoshopping this out or cutting these out, but it was more of kind of an act of investigation, inquiry, and of course, interrogation of these objects. An interrogation of what is the meaning of this object that we perceive to be true, but then the more I learned about the history of Minnesota, the more complicated these stories became. And of course, we know with the complicated nature of all history, dominant narratives are often the things that overshadow the absent narratives. So it really was an intention to kind of make space for these absent narratives to emerge. So I also wanted to talk a bit about influences and works that I was looking at while I was making this work. And then Alex and I have also had some really interesting conversations about some Indigenous artists that are dealing with ideas of memory and memorial. And so this first one is Lee Friedlander, which I think is maybe one of the most famous photographers dealing with the monument. And his project documents monuments in the American landscape, causing the viewer to kind of notice these objects in new ways. We often pass by monuments without sometimes knowing what they're commemorating. And Friedlander's images show monuments with the contemporary world kind of growing up around them, and asking us to consider how narratives and landscapes transform over time. I was also looking at Paul Shambroom. He's got this really wonderful project called Shrines, where he was traveling around the country looking at these objects of war that are embedded in landscapes as memorials, and then showing us the juxtaposition of these in relation to other signifiers in the landscape. So we see in this image, there's actually the image of the steeple and then this missile that's kind of this repeated form, not only in the horizon line, but also then repeated in the reflection. So there's this kind of really lovely way of juxtaposing different meaning, like what is the meaning of these different signifiers, and what does it mean to put objects of war in these kind of rural spaces, rural and suburban spaces. So Alex and I really both, I think, appreciate Javier Tavera's work. Um, Javier has been doing these monuments where he will actually kind of obscure the identity of figures like Columbus and Andrew Jackson and Robert E. Lee, and he thinks of these as kind of an act of protest. Which this is kind of an interesting concept to me, this idea of being able to take a photograph that is almost like a silent but powerful act of protest.
Yeah, so this is a piece by Nicholas Galanin, who is Klingit and Uganex. Apologize if I'm mispronouncing his tribal nation. This piece is Shadow on the Land, an excavation and bush burial from 2020 in Australia. And so it's literally a cast of a monument of Captain James Cook, who was a British explorer. And this monument's in Sydney Hyde Park, and kind of just, I don't know, as I'm looking at Michelle's work and looking at Nicholas's, I'm just seeing really a close connection of what does it mean once these memorials go down, and what does it mean to bury these murals, or what is the intention of replacing these monuments. But Nicholas's work, not only is it kind of like a protest piece, but also it's critiquing the excavation work of indigenous ancestors and objects that have happened and continue to happen and be resold onto like the black markets. Even that term black market I know is problematic, but that he is just critiquing this and calling for change. And so in this next image is photographed by Jada Gray Eagle, who's Lakota. It's a photo of the protesters in front of Cup Foods, the site where George Floyd was murdered. And now or I guess I'll let Michelle speak more to the place. But I wanted to share that there's been like a huge kind of solidarity movement between Indigenous, Native, and Black Indigenous people in the uprising after George Floyd's murder. And I feel like a lot of change has been due to action, to protesting, and then action in different ways than marching and protesting. For example, with social media, I feel like there's been a lot of influence in renaming the Washington racist mascot, which I think there's been people fighting to change it for the past, 50 years, since the 60s, or maybe longer than that. But that because of these actions, things have been changing. Michelle, I'm wondering if you want to speak about the memorial piece of the site.
Yeah, something that I think is so interesting about the space, which I should mention is fairly close to where both Alex and I are. So this has become a memorial space, a space to gather, a space to hold vigil. It's a memorial space that was actually built by the people rather than built by the state. And it was built out of a need for healing. So this idea of memorial action, which is something that Alex and I have talked quite a bit about, like what does it mean to start thinking about memorial as action, both in protest, but then also as a way of healing.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think it's really interesting in this space as well to think about who wants this to be a memorial, and just the different involvement of people nationally, of what people want versus like people from this neighborhood. and if they do want it to be a memorial or if they don't, and it's still a live and ongoing thing right now. Okay, so this image was taken a few weeks after the murder of George Floyd, which kind of spurred this fire across the nation and I think internationally of removing statues of conquerors or of symbols of conquest where they've been vandalized or removed. And I think this image is really significant, showing these indigenous people removing this statue of Columbus that's in front of our state capitol. Columbus is known for being many things for the indigenous community, not positive, being a symbol of a rapist, being a murderer, colonizer. So what does it mean to remove this statue? And actually I read an article today that taxpayers are going to be paying for fixing the site to putting it back up. And I'm questioning, what does it mean for taxpayers to fund this kind of symbol in such a public space in front of a government building?
I think that's a really interesting point, Alex. Also, just when we talk about like who are these for? There is actually a movement in the state of Minnesota to move away from calling Columbus Day, and instead calling it Indigenous Peoples Day, because there has been so much information that people have started to realize about Columbus as not so much um, the hero that perhaps we were taught that he was in school, at least back when I was in school, but maybe more about some of the realities of what that conquest meant for the indigenous peoples of the places that he went to, and some of the ways that they suffered as a result of the colonization and conquest that was happening during that time. But so this idea of action, this idea of like, what is it like, who are these for, who are these objects for, um, and what does it mean to actually take them down? And if one conversation that Alex and I have had is like, what does it mean to create a space or a monument that actually speaks to actually remembering the people or the thing that happened in a way um, that uses names. So this is a work by an artist by the name of Edgar Heap of Birds. And this work is titled Building Minnesota, which was commissioned by the Walker Art Center in 1990. I do actually think it's really interesting that this was commissioned by an art museum rather than the state. So this is, as we mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the Dakota 38. That was the largest mass execution to happen in United States history. And we'll talk a bit more about the commemorative marker that used to be there. But this is a work that was created in the 1990s to actually use the names of those who were executed. And Alex, I wondered if you would speak a bit to the significance of this particular piece.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I think it's fascinating that you mentioned that this is commissioned by an art institution, and monuments are pieces of artwork, but not necessarily commissioned by art institutions. And so their processes might be different than how a museum institution might research and come up with criteria with commissioning someone versus a government institution. Yeah, I think the fact that Edgar Heaps of Birds uses the Dakota names and spelling and translate it to English is just incredibly powerful. With now, I think in 2021, there's maybe 4 or 5 born Dakota speakers today. And so by creating this installation, I think is just incredibly important and powerful. And after they were placed, people had put tobacco ties and things honoring these 38 plus 2 Dakota, and I think there's maybe a few Ho-Chunk relatives that were murdered in this mass execution as kind of the end of the 1862 war. And I think I don't know, it's important to acknowledge that this institution commissioned this, but it wasn't that long ago that the Minnesota Historical Society had remains of Chief Little Crow, who was part of the Dakota Uprising, on view in the 70s. Like my dad saw the remains during a field trip. And so there is this really recent history of this. The Mayo Clinic brothers, after the hanging, some of the remains of the Dakota people were unburied and resold. And one of them was, I'm not sure the process of preserving a skeleton, but was on view in one of the Mayo Clinic's office and was recently returned. And they apologized for this. So this is just really, I think it's important to share the recent pain and trauma from this.
So this is the original marker that was in the place where the 38 were hanged. And the thing about this piece that in our conversation has been just underlined by Alex is this idea that you mentioned, Alex, about this being sort of dehumanizing, that saying here we're hanged 38, but then giving no names. And this was erected in 1912. So actually quite a few years after the occurrence happened. And then it was actually removed in the 1970s, lost in the 1990s. And now there's actually a memorial space that has a white limestone buffalo and a large scroll that has each of the names of the 38 who were executed in a space called Reconciliation Park, which I'll show that in a moment. But so this significant site, there's been a gas station, there's been a library, and it's kind of interesting to think about how these spaces change over time. But the significance of what happened there still remains, and the need for healing still remains. And I think that part of that healing, particularly for white culture, is knowing these stories and knowing that there is a need for healing, and learning these stories is so important. Alex, did you want to say anything else about this one?
Yeah, I wanted to add that I think it's interesting that this particular monument goes missing, and I think your work kind of implies that there's a need to understand what happened, but how do you do that? Like, how do you cancel a monument but still create space for narrative sharing by not completely erasing what happened?
Oh, that's such a good point. So this is the space that that exists now. There's a buffalo that's made out of limestone, and the scroll that has each of the names of the Dakota 38, and both in their Dakota name, but also in their English name. And then there's this bench that's also in this space that says, "Forgive everyone everything," which every time I think about that, I think that's such a big statement. But at the same time, this idea that there's a space to go and sit and be present, and actually be in this space. Like there's a consideration for this idea of action being part of memory. And so there's another quote by Susan Sontag that I want to share from her book called Regarding the Pain of Others. She says, "Compassion is an unstable emotion. It needs to be translated into action, or it withers." And so this idea that memory, memorial, remembering, all of these things are actions. And this is an important part of I think what a lot of memorials in the 21st century are beginning to look at, that it's our responsibility to be present and to learn these histories. So this is an image that I took a few years back. I think I mentioned in the beginning that I had been going to each of these memorial sites or monuments as close to the date of significance as possible. I think I also mentioned that when I would go to these places, I was often standing alone in the middle of a field or a forest or the side of the road looking at these obelisks. And when I went to this monument or memorial on December 26th at 10 a.m., this was the first time that I found myself in a sea of people. And this was a group of people that were gathering to wait for the Dakota 38 plus 2 Memorial Ride, which is something that happens each year to commemorate the Dakota 38 plus 2. And I wondered, Alex, if you would say a bit more about the significance of this gathering and everything that goes into it.
Yeah, this image just, from my personal memory, just takes me to the moment when they share that this is really just a place for healing, to teach youth and just really promote healing from this generational trauma of this. And there's multiple different walks and runs of different Dakota communities in Minnesota and the Dakotas and in Canada. I think some come down from Canada to be part of these reconciliation gatherings. But I think it's really important for all sides people to come together, to learn, to heal together of our shared histories.
And it was, I will say that I've only been one time. Um, and this experience, I think, was one of the most visceral experiences I think I had during this entire 4-year journey of going to all of these different places. But so I was there, and I was thinking I would take pictures when I was when I was there. But as I was standing there and amongst this sea of people, waiting for the riders to come riding into town. And I should mention this is a ride where they actually, I think, is it 2 or 3 weeks, where they ride the horses from the reservation in South Dakota all the way to downtown Mankato, which is hundreds of miles. And so I was standing there, and there's like all of these people, and you could see the warm white breath of everyone surrounding us in the cold winter air. And I struggled to kind of take a couple photographs, but once the beating of the hoofs on the pavement started kind of shaking the pavement, and there was just cheers from both the people who were waiting and cheers from the riders finally making their way into town. There was this moment where I took a couple pictures, but you can even see how the stoplights in the background are shaky, because it was such a powerful experience that I realized that I just needed to be present for that experience and not try to document it. And so I think one of the biggest things about this project for me was realizing that it's sometimes important to simply show up for things. Sometimes action and remembering is about being present. It's about listening, and it's for many of us. It's also about needing to live in a particularly difficult tension. Spending 4 years learning all of these stories. Minnesota is a more complicated place than it was before I started this project. But I value all of the lessons that I learned in this journey. And I think that so much of our journey together is learning each other's stories, and knowing more about the places that we live and the people who are indigenous to these places. So I think there's also this just in knowing that we need to learn the histories of the places that we live, and knowing that there's more than one perspective. I think that it's important to find ways to do the action of remembering. And so that is, of course, showing up and learning more about these places and listening. Um, Alex, do you have anything to share, just in terms of like what does meaningful action and meaningful remembering look like to you?
Yeah, not to sound cliche or anything, but I feel like your whole project is a great example of one example of things that we can do to learn by doing the work, doing the research, making space, providing space for others, like your obelisk table, to literally uplift others' voices, to hear them like speak directly from their perspective. By us co-presenting this presentation, like you're creating space for me, and I really appreciate that. And just sharing other artists is uplifting BIPOC artists, professionals, historians is really important and essential. Encouraging others to not only do land acknowledgements, but to do more, to research, to donate, help fundraise, uplift.
Thank you, Alex. This has been such an amazing conversation, and I just so appreciate your willingness to be in conversation about these different aspects of our state's history. And thank you.
I don't know if I thanked you, but thank you too. This has been
Thank,
really interesting to learn and be a part of.
and thank you, Jason Flack and Monroe Community College. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to be here today.